thanks everyone. Yeah, real quick intro. Joining me today, so we've Coleen, CISO at Segment. Been leading up and building their security teams and programs from scratch. Previously led teams at Twilio, part of the team taking that company public. First American title, CoreLogic. We have Adrian, who's been the CISO at Atlassian for about 18 months, I think, roughly, and previously spent time building security teams at Nest, Macromedia, Adobe, Android, a bunch of places you've never heard of. And then Joel, who's joined us from Splunk. Interesting, not only a CISO, but a security product, right, at Splunk, amongst other things.
Although I myself am not a security product.
No, Joel's not a security product, yes. Not yet.
Yeah, you are.
Kind of
a little bit.
Previously at Symantec, Google, and Starbucks, amongst other places. So I guess the first thing, I was actually going to kick over to Joel. So what is a CISO? Like, how should all these people here, I guess actually, quick question. How many people here work in a company that has a CISO? 1, 2, all right, that's about what I was expecting, maybe 4 more than I was expecting. So for all the people who don't yet work at a company with a CISO, what is a CISO and why does Splunk have one?
Yeah, good question. So what a CISO is not is an information security manager, but that's probably where you start, or maybe even started with somebody who was the security-minded person that was your lead developer that had insights into where customers had problems or where you had risks with code. Then you kind of grow up a little and you scale up and you have a manager of information security. And that person might be more operational focused or they might be more GRC focused. You heard from Lisa earlier on what GRC is and includes. And then you grow up a little more because you need some feedback. And once you get that feedback, it tells you need to have some incident response handling as Martine walked through. So now we've got security operations and we've got GRC and we've got a little bit of incident response. And you think to yourself, holy smokes, we need somebody to take the blame for this. And that's a CISO. So at that point, you need to affect business outcomes and not just technological vulnerabilities and small momentary sporadic issues. That's when you need a CISO, and that's what the CISO fulfills regardless of the location. Those are pretty the core tenets.
Yeah, well, I think I like that you mentioned outcomes because as I think you mentioned, like shifting from the security person to an executive, right? Executives own outcomes. So I think one follow-up for Adrian just coming down the line here, what kind of outcomes do you own as an executive in the security-minded position? Like, what's your top 3?
Sure. I think it's a mix, and it really depends on the scale of your organization. I think at a certain level, a few hundred people, then your CISO is expected to own technical results, right? What is our coverage of our scanning? What is the coverage of our detection network? What are the rates at which we're closing vulnerabilities? When your organization gets bigger, I think is really when you begin to see a CISO step into the true executive role. And at that point, it's how do they create an environment of responsibility, both within their team, but also across the broader organization where people are familiar with those goals and metrics. But ultimately, the CISO doesn't own those. They own creating an environment where it's possible for those to actually be achieved. So that's mostly what I spend my time doing is how do I build the team? How do I build an environment where there's a sense of responsibility and accountability for security woven into how we produce our products and how we deliver them to our customers.
Coleen, you're now your second straight first person in building up from scratch. How do you think about what's the right time to start that kind of process? Is it headcount? Is it revenue? I mean, what's the right way for founders to think about when they should be kind of tracking towards that's when we should put that hire in?
So actually at Segment, I was the second person who was caring about security. And then at Twilio, I was probably like the fourth. I think there's someone, Lisa could probably give me a better count of when I was. But thinking about when do you bring in somebody at this leadership level, it can be a combination of things. I think you need to really lay out for yourself, who are your customers, right? Are they all very risk averse, enterprise type customers? Are there lots of regulations on them and the data that you're handling for them? And then how many people do you have in your company? How spread out all over the world is your population? How complex is the problem? And I would say the more messy and scary it is, you probably need to bring this person in sooner. For reference, it could be, if it's pretty scary, you probably want to try to grab somebody in around 200 people. I don't know. because then you're starting to try to close bigger and bigger deals. And then you're going to start getting some really uncomfortable questions from your customers that your sales team and the team that you have is just not prepared to answer. And it is good to have somebody with not just a security mindset, but is security leadership that the enterprise goes, okay, thank goodness, you're not just some like fly-by-night operation. The company's actually thought about this. You're building a security program. You have a roadmap. You have a narrative. And I think your enterprise customers appreciate that. So the answer is it depends, but you definitely have to be honest about all of those aspects.
And even, and I guess this probably goes back to being somewhat dependent on how your risk surface area and the kind of data you handle. Are there things you can do earlier? I had someone was talking to me earlier in the green room talking about like, well, you can maybe bring in an advisor, right? Like if you're too small for a CISO, maybe you're like 20 or 30 people, but you know you're going to get there. Have you seen that done successfully? Do you work with companies that way? Joel, what do you think about that? I know we have some companies who have security-minded advisors who kind of give people foresight to that.
It depends upon the alacrity with which the team desire and then apply that. Otherwise, your advice, it's a short-lived relationship.
Right.
And really, the stage of the company matters a great deal. There's a company for whom I volunteer. They're a nonprofit. They do census integration. So when I met with them, it's a small team. It's 8 people, and they want everything. We meet weekly, and they want the list, and they come back and they say, we did these 7 things. What about this one? And how do we? And they're really aggressively soaking up this. So I have to be very careful with what I'm assessing. I need to know more about them so I don't dominate their strategy inappropriately. But in other cases, there are people that ought to be that desirous of an outcome that aren't, and in which case I wouldn't choose to advise because then it falls on deaf ears. It's worse to know what to do and not do it than it is to be honestly ignorant.
Okay.
Worse for whom?
Yeah.
for the individual. For example, if I tell you, here's the issues that you've got and here's the concerns, do you think, you know what, I think we've got it covered with this, and that. Then you build further on that. If you don't know and you're curious, you tend to investigate and understand your risks.
I think I would also try to frame it a little bit in what your expectations your customers might have relative to the data, and relative to expectations for your organization. And the higher those expectations are, the less comfortable I would be with the, I didn't know I should be securing stuff, and so I didn't look into it. But yeah, there's certainly some truth to it.
Those customers demand it though too, don't they?
Yeah, so if you're getting questions, that's probably a trigger for needing to figure out where to get that advice from, how to answer those questions.
Adrian, I think you kind of mentioned in the role like shaping culture, thinking. So as the CISO and that organization, like how should I think of it, do you set policies? Do you pick technologies? Do you some of both? Is there one that you stay away from? I think a lot of people naively like, oh, well, the security organization, they pick the tools and they install them and they run them and then we're secure. And but what does it actually fall into?
To all of the above. I have seen that it's particularly effective amongst security leaders is that they do all of those things, right? They create policy, they select technology, et cetera. But more than anything, they manipulate the people around them in a very conscious and intentional way, right? Everybody knows that they want to be secure, but nobody wants to spend time thinking about it. So the question is, how do you get other people to absorb what they need to do into their normal pattern of behavior? And that's the sort of subtle skill that the most successful senior security folks have. I've often pointed out that usually your first 1 or 2 or even 3 security folks, if they're coming up through the ranks as a technical person, is the person that you least want to talk to about security for any number of reasons, but probably in part because they're crazy. Because what they really, really care about is security, and that's scary, right, for an organization that's trying to grow. And so a lot of the function of a good leader in the security space is to be a buffer between the rest of the business and that crazy security person, and make sure that there can be a intentional, meaningful, valuable conversation, albeit not necessarily an entirely honest conversation, where that security value is driven into the business, and the business is able to continue doing itself. So a lot of the work of a senior leader in the security space, of a good CISO, is how do you incorporate that and help it facilitate the business as opposed to impede the business?
Yeah, well, so another thing that kind of interesting, as I was thinking about this role, it started to feel sort of analogous to, honestly, kind of like a CTO, where in large organizations, like, well, what does the CTO do? And it's like, well, they they work on internal technology, they work on external technology, they work on sales, they work on, I mean, what do you find, Coleen, the split? Because I would imagine even just for me with the software product, right? There's like, well, how do we make sure our software product is secure, right? And then you've got your IT side where, well, how do we make sure our internal organization is secure? And then how do we go talk to customers or analysts, or like, how do you find your split? Do you find yourself playing all those roles?
Absolutely. I think that is probably the biggest distinction, is that for somebody who's a first-time CISO, you realize how much of the business that you need to get to know and start to enable. You spend a lot more time with the sales team, getting to know like customer success, product. And so it's not just us on one side of the wall telling the rest of the company, you need to fix these things, which we've clearly outlined for you. Why aren't you doing them? It's also tying your company's success to your success. What is it that we can do to enable the sales team? And so you start blending the security program that you have. And then maybe one thing you might do is work with the sales team. Here's how to talk about the security that we have. Our internal security, here's how to talk about the product security. Here's how customers can use it. You might start creating documentation. You may even show up on site with a customer, or they may come on site and talk to you. And then I think you mentioned something about a CTO. I haven't worked in a company in a while that has had a CTO. My impression of it, and totally biased, is I think that's more of an older model for companies that have been established and been around for a long time. I think a CISO type person would report to the CTO, and that CTO is like a member of the executive team. I don't know that that's necessarily the case nowadays. I know myself, I report to an ET member who's like, he has a title of, it's VP of product development, something like that. So it's not a standard setup anymore.
Okay. I guess rapid fire. Adrian, who do you report to?
CTO.
CTO, old school. Okay.
Old school.
just according to Coleen.
But he has 2/3 of our org, so he has all of product and all of engineering.
Right. And then Joel, who do you report to?
CTO.
The CTO.
Yeah, he's an Earl, actually. So it is very old school.
Okay.
Really? An
No,
Earl?
not true. It's not true.
The Earl of Splunk, yes.
Is his name at least Earl? Come on, we're
I like the Earl of Splunk. That's pretty good.
Yeah. Well, it's actually kind of interesting to say, because one thing I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. So, and I just, as I dug in this, just got even more confused, because I was like, oh, we're going to talk about DevSecOps, and then immediately someone's like, you mean Sec DevOps, right? And it's like, whoa, okay. So before, we won't go there, but I am curious. We are seeing, maybe just saying like shifting left, right? And historically, I guess like security was kind of the last part of the waterfall to come over, because the developers, they were like, oh, we want to ship code faster, so we'll buy into this. And ops code is like, we want developers to sign up for responsibility. And they were like, but we can both agree nobody wants to talk to security, so leave them over there. But
you all can see why now, right?
Yeah, in legacy models, right? But now that we're seeing, so things like, we work with companies like Sneak that are doing dependency scanning, almost kind of like a CI process, or there's like RASP, like a runtime application self-protection stuff, like a Signal Sciences or a Screen or something, and that's getting more embedded. Are you seeing, I guess, Joel, are you seeing that kind of shift towards like, hey, let's make this less of a one-off thing that's a gatekeeper to like, we're part of the team now and working tightly with dev, ops, and the whole rest, IT?
I think that DevSecOps, Sec DevOps, Op DevSec, whichever order you put them in, it's a descriptor, it's not prescriptive. I mean, you can read the Phoenix Project, you can try to align to something that models that, but you've still got the main problem, and that is most security teams are the Department of No. Or you've got a reputation you didn't earn or are working hard not to have, that you're the Department of No. Maybe you're the Department of Yes If, or so you're typically a waterfall structure surrounding the Agile. Because it's the same thing with IT ops, and it's the same thing with cloud. They just want to get it done. And all you want to do is stop them from their perspective. So the more that we've begged the question, there is such thing as being secure. And I don't believe that that's true. I believe that there is managing our risk, seeing all of our risk, and understanding which risk we ought to manage in what manner. That works really well integrating into the DevOps environment.
I'm still overwhelmed by Colleen's enumeration of all the different parts of the company I'm supposed to be familiar with.
I know,
and
it's
interacting with.
I know.
And now I'm supposed to
not
be doing
an
that
easy
in real
job.
time as
I don't
well.
like people.
But yeah.
Every single developer
All
could
of the
potentially be
company?
shipping code.
That's ridiculous.
So I have a comment on the shifting left. I think it makes your entire security org's job easier if you can shift left. So specifically what that would mean is like, if your security team is going after folks and saying like, oh, we just scanned all the containers and there's like 19,000 highs, oh my God. So instead of figuring out how to create 19,000 tickets and then send them to the teams and have them do it, like, why can't we create scratch containers, right? So how do we make things so that they are secure and easy by default? And then replace what people are using with the secure and easy by default stuff. Same thing with like, why not use golden AMIs? Like, I just feel like if you have a team that's technical enough, which I hope you will, if you're building a security team, then they can figure out how everyone does their work. They can get into that pipeline and they can insert all of the stuff that they won't want in there. So by the time things come out of the end of the pipeline, and you scan or you inspect it, there will still be problems, but it's not an overwhelming set of problems. I remember when I worked at CoreLogic many, many, many years ago, and we had a physical data center and we had to actually do patching. It was awful. So we would scan, we'd find this multi-page report, and we're like, okay, well, that means we're gonna have to do patching 10 p.m. Saturday night. That's our maintenance window. Some of the patches wouldn't go well. First we had to do testing, and then sometimes it wouldn't go well. Machines wouldn't come back up again, and it was just so bad. And that's what happens when you're at the very end of it. So you can spare your team a lot of headache by just moving all of that stuff to like the first few things that people are doing.
Yeah, just to jump on the shift left, I think probably the single most important thing you can do if you're building a company at whatever scale it is to have yourself as an executive that's not in security, ask whomever, could be your sales guy, could be your product guy, could be your developer girl, whatever, what are you doing about security? And as soon as a CEO asks that, or as soon as the head of product asks that, you'll realize that the engineer or whatever other function it is can go back and think about it. And they're probably going to come up with an answer that's better at what they're doing than a security team being asked to answer that question. And it'll also give you an indication that your executive or whoever's in charge of getting this thing out the door cares about it. And that's how it becomes incorporated into the review process, right? So ask your architect, what are you doing about security? Then ask your developer, how are you thinking about security in the context of your development process? Then ask your testing team, how are you testing for security? You don't need to know whether it's a good answer. They will give you a good answer when they begin looking into it. And when you get to a point where each one of them has answered that, you've now got a development process that's more secure than any development process that's going to be built by a security team that comes in later. And it's as simple as just asking those people to care about it, think about it, and do something to demonstrate that. And then after the fact, you can hire a CISO who realizes that they've got a pretty cushy job.
Yeah, I mean, are you finding naively, like, I want to believe that in a post-GDPR world and with all these high-profile breaches, like Experian or Starwood, that at some level, if a developer or operator SRE has been paying any amount of attention, they start to get a little bit more than maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Like, okay, I probably should care about. Like, I'm going to have a bad time. Just like if the site's going down, like if we're up on the top of CNBC with like millions of records breached, like that's not going to be a good day for me. Are you finding that people are caring more about that? Because I would think that would make them more receptive to, again, your questions like, hey, you should care about security.
I mean, it's absolutely the case that this year or last year compared to 5 years ago, the board is asking, what are you doing? The CEOs are asking, what are you doing? The problem in that question is it's what are you doing aimed at the CISO or aimed at other people as opposed to what are they doing. One of the things, and I've been extraordinarily lucky in several of the companies that I've been at, inclusive of the one that I'm at right now, where the founders, the CTO, because we still have one even though we're old school, have said security is really, really important, and they give me headcount. Like I don't have to go say I need more people. They're like, we're thinking you're going to need this many. I'm like, well, that's twice as many as I was going to ask for. Sweet. And that sort of understanding of the expectation being that it should be a push, like security is really important, we're going to do everything we can, simplifies getting it into the sort of overall organization by a huge amount. And then it becomes just incumbent on me to do the right thing with the resources that have been provided.
So Adrian, you've presented two sides, and I agree with both sides, and I know you reconcile them. I'd like you to reconcile them out loud for the folks, and that is this. Previously, and I'm summarizing, security is everybody's responsibility. Ask the developer what they're doing, develop that culture, elicit from them their active participation in securing your environment. Then there's a centralization pushing security as a center of excellence. Again, my words, not yours.
Yep.
I see a both and there, not mutually exclusive.
Absolutely.
What do you see? How is it working for you?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think the ideal function of the CISO is to make sure that what's going on in the organization is best of breed, but they aren't going to be capable of actually doing it all. And so that's really the function, is to make sure you have good people that provide a counterbalance and a continuous ongoing assistance to the broader organization. But getting the broader organization to actually be secure is not something the security team can do. I just don't believe that. I do believe it's pretty easy for a CEO or a CTO or whatever in their quarterly meeting to just mention it. And it's coming from the mouths of babes, right? It's coming from that leader, and it's not the security person asking for it. So that means it'll get done.
Yeah, I mean, this is why you tell new CEOs you're not allowed to ask your team any question unless you want the answer for real. Because even if you say, hey, I'm just curious, it will be interpreted and followed out. So I think that's smart. Following on that, so I mean, one of the ways with DevOps, I remember going back 10 years ago, the high-level stress test, if you're a DevOps team, was like, well, do you have a NOC? Because DevOps is killing the NOC. What about calling the SOC? Is that still a thing, or is that something that's important?
So yeah, here's my bias showing again, because I choose to work for smaller companies where we're like, okay, what can we dispense with that we don't need to invest in anymore? The answer is it depends. So if you're a very small company and you have limited resources, and you find that you need a SOC, there are services that you can employ that will provide that for you. But again, if you are very developer heavy, and so is the security team that you're building out, they can provide a huge amount of automation. So I think the future of a SOC, So the future of this is, so if you imagine a SOC right now, it's maybe it's 25 people on one shift. There's dashboards all up there. Maybe they have windows that smoke over. It's pretty cool. And each of these people are employed with runbooks. And so there are different teams in the company that say, when this alarm happens, I want you to take the following actions: push these buttons, run this script, do this thing. So if you are very technology focused and you look at that, you're like, why is it that there are humans who are doing this? Isn't the best and highest use of humans figuring out how to automate these tier 1 and tier 2 types of problems? If it's something that's repetitive, if it's something that requires them to act quickly and then act consistently, have people automate that part of the job away. I would say that rather than have a SOC long term, then you have CERT folks who are probably at tier 3 or tier 4, and they spend most of their time hunting. So imagine all the basic stuff is taken care of. An alarm comes in, looks like so-and-so is logging in from Japan, and that's really weird because they don't normally log in from Japan. Slack message goes to that person, is this you? Yes, it's me. So that kind of stuff can be just automated away. But then take those same people who would be just pushing buttons and sending those messages and have them understand, if it's AWS or GCP, what that environment looks like. What does baseline normal look like in that environment? What starts to look really weird? Pay attention to danger signs on your app. Are people abusing your app? Are people inside the company doing something they're not supposed to? Spend the time, instead of pushing buttons, having those people threat hunting and then figuring out the bigger, juicier attacks. And then later they get to a point where, is a nation state attacking me? That's how you would want to use human time, and you want to use robots to do the tier 1 and 2 stuff. But that's just
It's more like threat analysts and that kind of capability.
Yeah.
Did you have, Joel? I wasn't sure if you had something about.
No,
SOC.
we also sell robots.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess speaking on hiring, something I want to dig into, and you mentioned, so it's good to hear that the investment is not just in hey, here's your title and your mandate and go convince the rest of the team to be secure, but actually building out people. I mean, Joel, these days, what kind of people are you hiring into your organization? If I think again, kind of naively, historically, it's we'll hire some pen testers, right? And they'll poke at the app. Or what kind of things are you hiring in-house versus automating versus maybe outsourcing to consultancies or places like HackerOne or whatever?
I want to start the answer backwards, which is, we talked about this earlier, what's the outcome that I'm after? So the question about the SOC, well, what's the outcome that you're after? Why is there all this interest in traceability if the NOC's gone? Well, what's the outcome that I'm after? I'm after fault investigation. I'm after disparate analysis. Who's doing that? The developer? No, not ever. So who's doing it? So what's the outcome that we're really after in this process? So when it comes to hiring, the tech is relatively easy. It's a tool you can put in somebody's hand often. And my personal belief, more of a belief than a fact, is that products wound employees. The more products I purchase, the more I limit the capability of my team. World War I, we learned that if you shot to wound, you take out 3 of the enemy soldiers, because it took 2 to carry the wounded, crying, screaming person off the battlefield. You shoot to kill, and you only take 1 out. So if I bring out CrowdStrike, if I bring out Carbon Black, if I bring out Tanium, y'all have one of those probably. Now I've taken somebody who's a security analyst, and I've made them a product specialist. And their world and their advancement in their career tends to be captured by that product. Splunk's got the same problem, right? You become a ninja, you become captain, so you stop being a data analyst or a risk manager in large part and start being a tool professional. So when we hire, we don't hire people that are good at tools. We hire people that are good at being adaptable, they're being agile, they know how to set their own goals, they know what the business goals are. My best SOC manager, we still have, but anyway, he came from the Peace Corps, where for 3 years he did water reclamation in Africa. He didn't know anything about security, but he knew crisis, and he knew managing disparate people across multiple time zones, and he knew how to think long and work into it. So what's the goal? What are the core components of that goal? And then to me, the tool's the very bottom thing, typically.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, it's always in part of these movements, I think, always emphasize people and culture over tools, right? The tools are just the side effect of the people and the culture.
Supposed to be. But tools dominate.
This is true.
Often. Yeah.
I mean, it is an interesting question. I know we have a lot of people, a lot of founders in the audience building very early stage companies who are looking to build tools and sell product solutions, not tools.
They won't wound you. They'll fix you.
So how are these vendors, what's the right way to think about, because I think everybody understands intuitively, like, oh, if they corner you somewhere and kind of give you a cold pitch, like that doesn't work. So like what does work?
It could work,
yeah.
Right? But you love your tool because you spent so much time with it, and it's beautiful to you, and it's elegant, and you solved a hard problem with elegance and panache. And man, I can't wait for you to see this. And he's thinking, holy smokes, dude, like I got a board meeting tomorrow, and I got to go through my PowerPoint tonight, and I got to figure out what does it do?
Andrew touched me.
I'm going to do it again.
But really, right? Like you reached out and you got into my space. No, not in this instance. But like that's the problem, right? Is that somebody's getting in there to talk about their thing, and it's
keep going. Or
Coleen, that's really
right. I mean, what is Adrian? What is the right vector though? What's the ideal if someone's thinking about like getting in front? Is it figuring out exactly what your initiatives are for that year?
Marketing 101 is like try to understand the problem, try to describe the problem, and then just end the conversation. Like really, like if that's your problem, then let's talk more, and then see whether it is. Engage with how it's explained, how it comes back at you, and sort of go from there. We have a solution in that space, but I really want to understand and make sure that I know what it is that you're dealing with, and how you're approaching it and how you're thinking about it. And I think that is a more meaningful type of conversation to have, and it's the one that certainly is a good introduction. It shows that you actually care a little bit, which is nice.
Okay.
It's also how you create champions with your customers too. Because if you just show up and you're like, I have this thing that's all wrapped up and I need you to buy it, and then you try to like fit their situation to the solution that you already have, it can come across a bit tone deaf. And I think that security leaders are a little bit cynical when it comes to when we say like, hey, we don't want any more snake oil. We bought plenty of those in the course of our career. I think it's better to think about approaching a security leader and seeing how you could partner with him or her for the next 5-10 years of their career. What is it that's keeping them up at night? What have they not been able to solve? And can you articulate it with them? Even if you don't have anything to sell to them today, just listening to what is that thing that's still a blind spot for you? And that can give you some really good insight on what it is you could build.
Switching gears a bit, semi-related. We're about 18 months into a post-GDPR world. So it's kind of shit. I mean, I know one of the last gigs is not things I did as an operator was help with the global GDPR rollout. Tens upon tens of executives involved across a bunch of business units. I was just amazed at like how much went into it. How have you felt now that it's come and gone and we're into it? Like, what was the biggest surprise or non-surprise about the whole thing?
It's not gone. It's just
Yeah.
now real.
Well, right. Yeah. Sorry. Well, from an
Holy
engineer,
smokes, it's gone?
Sorry.
I got to call some people.
I was in like an engineering leadership position. So once we shipped it, it was done.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, right.
I'm not
That's
sure
called
what you're talking
DevOps.
about. Yes, DevOps. Right.
So we've gone through this 100 times. Am I exaggerating? I don't think I am. So we had
not
Graham
sure
Lynch
what
Bliley
this
and
is.
Sarbanes-Oxley,
see.
and we had BITS, and we had HIPAA, and we had high tech, and we had Massachusetts 201 CMR 17, which was the personal
There's SOX in
identification
there
rule. We
somewhere.
had
The Y2K problem.
YTK, right? But we had these regulatory requirements that came with a penalty that was amorphous, and it would be, we'll determine it later. And then the regulatory requirements themselves are subjective. You need to execute reasonable due care to protect customer information, unless they've committed fraud, unless they're likely to have, unless you need it for other reasons, unless, what do I do with this? So it's following the same pattern as some of these others.
I mean, the way I would frame it is historically, both security and privacy have been areas where the core question is, are you meeting an unstated expectation that's been set by a customer, where every one of your customers has a different set of unstated expectations?
Did you work at Google?
Yes.
All right.
We had a few customers. They'll tell you their expectations after the fact is the other thing that you learn. So it's kind of nice actually to have some basis for minimum bar to involve in the conversation. And then the other thing that was kind of nice is historically there's not a real good grounding in law about what security means, right? For a long time, I was able to pretty, I think, convincingly argue no matter what we did, we weren't going to get sued. Because nobody had ever been sued for not having patches, for not having...
Yep.
Now that's beginning to change, but 10 years ago, especially if you were in the packaged software business, there was no responsibility whatsoever to build a secure product. So you had to sort of claw your way into being able to make those arguments in a meaningful way, and then you had to begin to intuit out of a customer what their expectations were. So GDPR at least puts a baseline on if you have customer data, there are some fundamental things that you need to do that simplifies the conversation. So that I think has helped a lot. And I actually think all of the tenets that are in there are pretty straightforward and pretty consistent with what you would expect. They are just not what was necessarily in products that had been built previously.
Right. Yeah. I think what fascinated me, part of going through the process, was how little, there's not, I used to say to my team is like, yeah, there's not like some JUnit tests we can run that go green when we're GDPR compliant. Like the whole thing is actually one giant internal negotiation between us and general counsel.
Yeah.
Because general counsel at the end of the day is the one who's going to sign up and say, I'm willing to, go defend this, right? So do you find yourself, Coleen, like, does Segment have a GC at this point? Okay.
We do.
Is there more of a FinSec op dev there? Do you work with GC a lot? Do you have a close relationship with them?
What was the word you used?
FinSec OpDev.
Yeah. We're just going to keep adding them.
We are pretty close with the GC, and it's a relatively small legal team. But going back to your earlier point, like every couple of years there's a new thing, and coming January 1st there's
2 months, right?
CCPA. So I think we should never get to the point where we're like, compliance, privacy solved. There's no solved. I think just really rebooting what you have and saying, okay, all of these things have a ton of things in common. Based on this, like, are we doing these things? Is this how we're set up? And if we're not, then make those permanent changes, because then the next time something comes in, you're not going to be knocked sideways and you're not going to panic. There might be some small changes that you need to make, but I'm betting if you as a company handle GDPR well, then you are set up very, very well to handle CCPA. And then probably, what other state is going to come up with their own privacy law, you'll be set up well to handle that as well. And then when we, at a federal level, pass our own thing, and it's our own GDPR, then you'll be set up well. I would just encourage you to take a look at your practices, compare against each of the tenets within, like, the different articles. For example, one great thing would be data minimization. If your organization collects data on either your own employees or on your customers, always having a mechanism to understand, what am I collecting? Do I need to collect it? Is this personal data? Do I need to keep all of it? How quickly can I get rid of it? And then am I very transparent about this collection and how I handle it with my customers? And just kind of like going through a cleaning cycle all the time. Like you want to look at data as radioactive, which means you don't want to hold on to a whole bunch of it for a really long time because it's going to hurt you. Eventually, you're going to die from it. So
One thing I would flag, I think is implicit in what Coleen was just saying, is it's not a matter of looking at GDPR and enumerating it and then comparing against it, and then CCPA and enumerating and comparing against it. The right approach, if I can be so bold as to say the right approach, is to look at the thing you're building, define its properties relative to general principles that you find in some of those pieces of legislation, and then compare those general principles, which you're going to hold very firm, to the pieces of legislation. And over time, you'll see, oh, you know what? When I do an ISO certification, it's a little bit different from a SOC 2, but it's tiny, as opposed to a standard compliance approach. Is I'm going to do this certification and make sure I hit these 100 things, and then I'm going to do another certification. I'm going to do these 100 things, and it feels really, really overwhelming. But the reality is, all of these rules, all of these different compliance regimes are like 98% the same. So if you just define your model for your product from a security standpoint, from a privacy standpoint, it's pretty easy to then see whether you need to tweak your model and then just constantly reinforce application of your model onto your engineering team, your DevOps team, et cetera, as opposed to pointing them to the piece of legislation. So that's where GDPR, I think, overwhelmed a lot of people, because we suddenly were talking to legal over and over and over again, as opposed to talking to, I don't know, the product security architect or privacy architect who should have thought about this already and incorporated those principles into their design. Now, a lot of people didn't have that, so it was necessary, but you don't want to be constantly going back and having a negotiation with your general counsel about how you're going to comply, or with your compliance person.
That's totally a life hack. If you do that, you will spare yourself hours of drinking, regrettably. Check out the Security for Startups thing. It gives you the core of that. The differences you find between PCI and ISO and FedRAMP and SOC 2, yeah, I store logs for 7 days. I store logs for 3 days. My password's 7 characters long. My password's 15. All right, so what's my highest common denominator that if I do this as my principal? Now all my dominoes fall. Pick it and know it. And it's really, you will pay a lot of money to do this 6 times, or you could pay no money to do it once. And I'm really not exaggerating. That's really a good tip, Adrian.
The same thing is true with answering questionnaires from customers. If you can't proactively answer on your own paper, the first 50 questions on every one of those questionnaires, you're doing it wrong. Because what you want to do is say, hey, cool questionnaire, here's my answers, come back and let me know which things I missed.
Right.
And that'll save you a ton of time.
But I think that you're
They'll
at
still ask you.
you're larger companies.
They'll still ask you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, they'll still come back
we
to you. You
still
can't
have
make
to
them
fill it
robot.
out, even
Yeah,
if we
yeah.
already have all the answers. Yeah. I think
High-paced.
that might be the difference between a large and small company, no?
All right. Well, hey, I want to thank, hey, everybody can join me in thanking. What a great panel we've had to end out the day here. We're at time.